honor of a lifetime to introduce to you our Senator Marco Rubio. He was elected to the United States Senate in 2010, and he set about one objective, and that objective was to help bring the American dream back into reach for those of us in the world who felt as though it was slipping away. And that is the goal that the senator wakes up every day chasing, and he strives to exceed. It's the benchmark he measures his work by. He is passionate about the American dream because he's lived it himself. His parents came to America from Cuba in 1956. They worked hard in humble jobs to earn their life in the middle class. It's their loving and powerful example. He learned from them the importance of work and family and developed the belief that all things are possible in America. Senator Rubio has spent most of his life right here in South Florida and living in West Miami. He lives there today with his wife Jeanette and their 4 beautiful children, and I think they've all started school this week too. Prior to being sworn in as the senator for Florida in 2010, he served as a city commissioner for West Miami, and he also served in the Florida House of Representatives from 2000 to 2008, and he served as the Speaker of the House in 2006 to 2008. So we have a lot to learn from him. We're very honored on his time home that he's going to spend some of it with us. So it's my privilege to introduce to you Florida's senior senator, our native son, the Honorable Marco Rubio.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, you don't have to. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. So, first of all, your lineup is, I'm sorry, I closed your book. Is that okay? Just, I didn't, for you know, I'd be out recognizing elected officials again, so I don't want to. I learned something today is if you're here as an elected official or candidate and want to be recognized, you got to join the Forum Club. Right. All right. Pick up on those things pretty quickly. But thank you for providing me this opportunity to speak to you. I'm actually excited about the opportunity to talk to you for a few minutes, and I want to thank you for providing this forum to engage as your stimulate thought and promote dialogue. I think it'll be in line with much of what I'll hope to share with you today. You know, I thought a little bit about what to talk to you about coming in August as you start your season doing these things. And I had a choice between you know, talking about the issues, specific issues with regards to Florida, which I'm sure many of you would be interested in, and perhaps we'll get to some of those in your questions as well, or sort of a broader view of where we stand as a country, and I chose to do the second because to be honest with you, there's very few places that I could do that anymore. There are very few places where you can talk. No, really, I mean, and to talk in a big picture way about sort of the way you view things. Understanding there might be some that disagree with you and others that have thoughts that they want to add to it. And so that's why I'm really grateful for the chance to do it. I do it with some trepidation, only because I know that we live in an era in which nuance is not really around much anymore. It's very difficult to talk about complex topics in ways and nuanced issues in a way that isn't somehow mischaracterized. I don't intend to say anything outrageous today, by the way, but that said, you know, you want your message to come across, and it's difficult in an era where sound bites and outrage dominate. So I hope just to transmit to you some of the things I've had a chance to think about in both the 8 years that I've now been in the U.S. Senate and the opportunity I had to run for president, and the chance I've had to be out of Washington now for 3 weeks, which is an extraordinary detoxification process with no withdrawal, by the way. And so I think it starts with what you mentioned in your introduction. I do believe America is a very special place that, by the way, is different from being a perfect place. I believe anything that has to do with mortal men and women will never be perfect. But the one thing that's been extraordinary about the American story is, number one, we are trying to do something no one has ever done. The idea that you could take all kinds of people from all different parts of the world, backgrounds, thoughts, and beliefs, and increasingly so in terms of its diversity, and from it create not just one nation, but one people, and a successful one at that, in a republic in which they actually get to choose their leaders at the ballot box, and through an economic model that allows you to go as far as your talent and work will take you is, frankly, no other place has ever tried it. There are plenty of nations that have tried democracy and walked away from it because they felt they couldn't govern a country in which they could never get a governing majority. There are nations that sort of speak to the idea of some of the things that we talk about, but few have ever tried what we have tried and continue to try to do. I always say the American Revolution that began in 1776, the war ended, but the revolution has continued because the America, its founding principle, was revolutionary. And I think it's a great credit of our country. One of the things that I point to about being special is that each generation has brought us closer to the ideals upon which this nation was founded on. It is clear that when this nation was founded, the principles and ideals upon which it was founded on did not apply to all people. In fact, it didn't apply to well over half the population. Women couldn't vote. You had to own land to vote, and even that was restricted to people of certain color and background. Human beings were enslaved in this country, which just is not does not, frankly, consistent with the principles that our nation was founded upon. But I think it is a testament to America's greatness that every single great cause, every single great change in our history has been a fulfillment of our founding principles, not in spite of them and not a contradiction of them, but a fulfillment of them. The notion that no nation founded on the belief that all men and women are created equal, endowed by their Creator with the rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, no nation founded on that principle could possibly coexist with some of the institutions and practices that once characterized us. And so that revolution, the war ended, but the revolution continues, and it continues in the hands of the generation that's here today. I'm always pleased to see students. I'm actually happy that students today, I remember 10 years ago, you had to beg people to care about politics, right? Now everybody cares about politics, and it's everywhere. I mean, honestly, there's nowhere you can go in society today that isn't infused with politics, from sports to entertainment. I imagine pets are probably the last place where we've been able to protect from that, but that apparently could change as well, so let me not jinx it. So here's what I wanted to share with you about my thoughts. I think the current era that we live in, these are my views, and feel free to disagree after I leave. No, I'm kidding. But the first is sort of, frankly, we are a nation today that is living through, for lack of a better term, a couple of protest movements. And I don't mean the way you think. I mean just a general rejection of the status quo. And you can track it to a number of things. Certainly the uncertainty of 2007 and 2008, when that long ago, really shook the foundations of a lot of people's lives. And from an economic standpoint, we may have recovered, but from a psychological standpoint, its scars remain. There are a lot of people who remember a time where, for example, investing in your home was one of the safest things you could possibly do. No one had ever lived in an era in which your property declined in value, much less collapsed, in which half your neighbors were foreclosed on, in which entire industries collapsed overnight. It happened. People lived through it. Many of the young Americans today watch their parents struggle and agonize over that period of time. And so that certainly is a trauma particular to America and some parts of the world. But there's a broader one at play, and it explains a lot about what you see around the world, and that is an extraordinarily rapid and widespread economic transformation. Not economic downturns, recessions and growth periods. Those cyclical periods have always existed. What's unique is that what's changing is the very architecture of the global economy. And it's happening faster than it's ever happened before. So the Industrial Revolution was such an era, and it was incredibly transformative and disruptive. There were people left behind by industrialization. Entire industries wiped out. Millions of people that moved from the countryside into cities, and we face challenges all around the world as a result of it. But not this fast, not this rapidly, not in the pace and scale that we see today. And these protest movements have manifested themselves now for about a decade in American politics. You can track it back to 2010 with the surge in the Tea Party movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement that followed it. You go to 2016, and the energy in that campaign, President Trump's campaign, was frankly, an attack on conventional and orthodox politics that many on the right thought had failed the Republican Party, and he ultimately wins that primary and the presidency. But even on the Democratic side of the aisle, Bernie Sanders mounts a campaign that no one saw coming. And from a point of view that Democrats had largely avoided for 25 years, and that is from the way to the left of where most of its nominees had come from. And then you go to the 2016 results, in which President Trump is elected in a race a lot of people didn't think he was going to win. And again, by challenging orthodoxy, both within the party and the broader American political realm. And you see it today manifest in the Democratic primary, where you have seen that the reaction to President Trump has been, from many of the candidates, moving even further left on ideas that 5 years ago would not have been within the mainstream of the Democratic Party. I'm not opining. I have my own views on the wisdom of those positions on both sides, but it's an observation about the way politics has reacted. It's also global, though. It's virtually every Western industrialized economy is going through similar upheavals. And nation after nation in Europe, you are seeing the rise of nationalistic politics, meaning people that are starting to argue in nationalism and populism that it is time for us to care about our country. Obviously, in their argument, it's embedded within the context of the European Union. But even in the case of Brexit, which was probably one of the early waves of seeing that, embedded in all of these things, though, is you've seen the yellow vests in France, and it's manifested itself over and over again. But embedded in all of these protest movement is a feeling that there is a segment, perhaps a majority in many countries of a population that feel like no matter what you want to describe the status quo as, it isn't working for people like them. Yeah, I know unemployment is low, I know consumer prices are this, I understand all that, but I am unhappy and unease, and I don't have a lot of ease about what is happening today in this economy and what it means for people like me. And that's embedded across many of the industrialized economies, if not all of them across the world, but especially in the West. Added to that in many places is a feeling of either humiliation or disrespect, political disrespect or humiliation, that people like them are made fun of or mocked or mistreated. That exists in many places. The economic displacement. I'm talking about entire industries that have vanished because of foreign competition, because the industry is no longer needed, because it became outdated and obsolete. That's part of this transformation that we're talking about. And in some countries, and this has been true throughout history, mass migration events. You know, when you had the uncertainty in Northern Africa and the Middle East, it created migratory pressures in Europe. And we've seen that obviously play out here in the United States and now even in Canada, where it's become a campaign issue in their elections. And by the way, that's not unique to the 21st century. Anytime you have seen pressures on borders of countries, particularly when the places people are coming from are different from the country they're coming into, there has been a natural reaction throughout history. The United States, for example, adopted very restrictive immigration policies in the 1920s and early 30s as a result of mass migration happening in Europe after World War I, displaced millions of people. And so, again, I'm describing all this to you to sort of lay the groundwork for, not just in the United States, but globally, there is a growing number of people in Western industrialized economies who feel displaced or disrespected or left behind, and added to it and embedded in all of that is the changes that are happening and the disruption. The second thing that characterizes our era is incredibly sharp divisions in a society. Now, every society has divisions, and I would argue that the more diverse you are, the sharper and broader those divisions become. And America is a nation that has many divisions, urban versus rural, level of education, where you live, coastal versus middle America, you name it. I mean, we like to talk just about partisan divisions, but they exist. They exist across the country, and there are probably more of them than ever before. We are more diverse than we have ever been. And what often happens in these cases is that certain groups in society, or many groups for their own reasons, in fact, I would argue that every group in America represented by some division has some form or some argument to make about feeling powerless in the face of conditions in the world that simply, conditions that don't work for people like them. And it is natural in many cases, and certainly those types of feelings become vulnerable to the argument that this is the result of others, meaning people outside the group who have done things to make you feel this way, or make you be in this position. It could be other countries, it could be other groups, it could be other individuals, but nonetheless, that is a feeling that people have. And then the natural instinct becomes you got to fight for your group. You've got to fight for your group, and it may not just be Republican or Democrat. It may be, rural versus urban. It may be conservative versus liberal. Whatever it might be, the argument that we need to fight for people like us and our group against those conditions or elements in society that are hurting us. And increasingly, that becomes a zero-sum game. The belief that the only way I can win is if someone else loses. And so that begins to become even more pronounced. And it is all made even more difficult by a growing cultural bias against compromise. Because when people talk about compromise, it's one of the things I have trepidation about using as a term. People immediately sort of assume of saying, well, what you mean basically is, compromise means different things to different people. For some people, compromise means when you agree with me. And for other people, compromise means when you flip-flop or sell out or give in. But we do have cultural bias in this country increasingly, not just against compromise, but against changing your mind. It's the only aspect of our life in which we criticize people for changing their mind. Okay, because people change their mind all the time on everything from where they want to go to school to who they want to marry to where they want to live. Sometimes people think they want one thing, but after learning about other things, decide the other things are better. In politics, however, once you take a position, if you were to ever change your mind on the basis of new information, it is catastrophic development in terms of how people view you. So that's a problem, but it goes deeper than that. Sometimes, in order to reach compromise, it's viewed as a betrayal of your group. What group are you a part of? How can you possibly compromise with the other side? You've betrayed us. Or you're a double agent. You actually never were a part of our group. And we knew it all along. Or you're just weak. You're scared. And so that's why you're doing it. I'll get on that more in a moment. But basically, every issue, every part of our life is increasingly viewed through this lens. And you don't believe it. I can example this terrible sports, entertainment. I highlighted that earlier. But, you look at this case, this terrible case with this Epstein guy, and you go online, and it's like there's one group that's saying Hillary Clinton murdered him. And there's another group saying, no, Trump had him murdered. This is how insane some of this stuff has gotten. And you can go further, but it can no longer just be that this was a sick person who did some horrifying things. And frankly, he knew people in politics, but maybe it's not like a partisan thing. Maybe he's just a sicko, and those people exist. The third and last point, and then I'll tie it all together, is our culture. And so if we talk about the economic displacement and the grievances people have, and we talk about sort of the divisions that exist in our society, all of that is increasingly infused by a culture that is increasingly susceptible to myths, to irrational thinking, to outrage, to conspiracy theories. The core myth is perhaps the one we struggle with the most, is that we have these incredibly complex problems, because they're complex, but there's these very easy solutions if we just did this solution. And the fact of the matter is, it's a tough thing to accept. There are complicated problems, and they don't have simple solutions. There are some problems, frankly, that don't have a perfect solution, and foreign policy is a great example. In foreign policy, more often than not, you are not choosing between the right answer and the wrong answer. You're choosing between two bad options, and you're trying to figure out which of the two is less bad, which of the two is less harmful to the national interest. But it's hard to sort of communicate that today, where increasingly people argue, well, there's just some simple solution. Other times, they don't even pretend that there's a solution. And so when an issue arises and there's no solution, then it's not about what you're for, it just becomes about what you're against. You're defined not by what you think we need to do about it, but who do you blame for it and what can we do to get rid of them politically or otherwise. But we're also very vulnerable increasingly to all sorts of myths and things of this nature, conspiracy theories. I pointed that just a moment ago to one of them. But there are also media narratives. And this is not to beat up on the media, trust me. I believe that a free and open media, including those that disagree with you and those who have a right to be wrong, especially about me, I suppose. But sometimes it's easier to communicate in simple narratives. And I increasingly find that, for example, in foreign policy, just to go back to it again, right? You're either a hawk or you're a dove. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It really is. To sort of characterize these complex positions with a terminology that makes it easier to write about or report on does no justice to the issue. So there are some widely promoted narratives, frankly, sometimes by politicians as well, that are difficult to really give the full scale of what we're going through. And then fueling all of this is the fact that we are increasingly getting our news, our information, and our interaction with other human beings on social media platforms. I'm not one of those people that think social media is the end of the world. I'm not one of those people that believe social media will solve all the world's problems either. But there are algorithms, and increasingly those algorithms mean that you are being connected to news sources that agree with you. So you're getting information that confirms how right you are, and people who agree with you. and at the expense of being exposed to ideas and thoughts about others. I always encourage people, read the papers you think are the most biased against you, so at least you know the arguments they're going to use against you. But nonetheless, we are increasingly divided from one another that way. That touches on another topic, which is how segmented we become as a society. You know, there was a time, and others, this is not original thinking, others have been, there's been studies done on this and reporting, when Americans shared a lot in common. So you may have voted for different people in November, but your kids went to the same school, or you attended the same church or synagogue. Maybe you were on the PTA together, or you were members of an organization like this. So you knew a lot of things about someone. Right? You didn't just know about their politics, you knew them as a parent, you knew them as a spouse, you knew them as a coworker, you knew them as a neighbor, you knew them as somebody who was working on something else with you. Increasingly, the only thing we know about other people is who they voted for. And I'm telling you, if all you know about someone is who they voted for, it's a lot easier to be angry and hate them and dislike them than if you know all these other things about them. But we live in a society that's increasingly segmented from one another. In fact, you can watch some of the leading cable news outlets, pick whichever one you want, and put two different people watching two different streams of information. And they'll talk about the same issue, and they don't live on the same planet. They're not even the same universe. That happens increasingly now. Look, there's nothing wrong with it. It's legal. What I'm saying is that it does have a societal impact. And if it was just that, that'd be easy. But we are increasingly segmented from one another. We are increasingly less likely to know people that have different views than we used to. And that has manifested itself. Some of it is driven, by the way, by the things I just pointed to, the algorithms. And then, of course, the last point I want to make is, because of this new era, it makes one of the complicating factors, I don't want to dwell too much on it, but it's important. You know, these are actively promoted divisions. Why are these divisions promoted? They're promoted, number one, because they're good for ratings. Okay, I think it's, again, I told you I'm not here to beat up on the media, but I'm here to tell you the media is a for-profit entities, and they have to justify advertiser rates. And those are justified by clicks on websites and eyeballs on TV screens or handheld devices. And when you look at it, if I write a story that's divisive, conflictive, and about anger and outrage, a lot more people read about that stuff than some nuanced reporting on a topic, on an issue that maybe ends up in a good news thing. So that's why a lot of things pass that you never hear about. And that's why you hear a lot about outrage and about things that people fight over, because frankly, more people will click on a story about that. That's just a fact. But it's not just the media, by the way. Politicians have figured that out. So if I am a member of Congress and I want to become famous, I'm not going to get famous by going on TV and sounding reasonable. I'm going to get famous by going on TV and saying outrageous stuff. One side will hate me, the other side will love me, but I can tell you this, my mailing list is going to grow, my fundraising is going to go up, maybe so are your death threats. But the point is that, and I don't say that as a joke, by the way, because in some cases you just don't know. And you know, I was talking to a member of Congress recently who said, oh, I got a bunch of death threats. And all I said is, it's always been my feeling, I don't worry about the people that call. I worry about the ones that don't. And, but anyway, and then added to all this, by the way, and it's a point I really feel strongly about. I know there's been a lot of coverage about Russian interference in the elections, but I want to tell you that the biggest danger is not that. That's certainly something that we need to be careful about. The influence campaign, I cannot state enough how widespread it has become. Anytime there is any conflict in American society of any sort, these people online, these trolls that they employ, come out of the woodwork on both sides, pushing hashtags. They were all over this Epstein stuff. You just saw the surge of Russian troll activity on both sides, pitting us against each other. You pick a fault line in American politics, they jump on it. You know why? Because they want this. Informational warfare, psychological warfare is a key component of taking on another country. They know this. They want to demoralize you internally to take away your ability to respond. And they have always done this. This is not new. The only difference is that they now have these platforms they can do it on. And that is something that existed before 2016. It existed before 2016, and it won't just be Russia. We see the Iranians have tried it. Just the other day, we saw that one of the responses of the Chinese Communist Party to the uprisings and the protests in Hong Kong was to create over 1,000 fake accounts to push narratives. Global, because they can't read Twitter in China, it's banned. So who's reading that stuff? It's to influence public perception around the world about the Hong Kong protesters as violent, dangerous, terrorist-style people, so that if they have to send in troops to quash it, it'll be a response to terrorism, not an authoritarian crackdown. This is a 21st century reality we're going to have to confront. So I've touched on these three things because now you're going to say, well, now what? Well, you'll have to come back next year for my, no, I'm kidding. I think that the first thing is we have to, on both sides of the aisle, recognize that a lot of what's embedded in these protest movements are valid concerns. And I'll start with my end of the aisle. You know, I am a believer in the free market, 100%. I believe the free market is the single best way to create growth and prosperity that humankind has ever experienced. I don't believe it's perfect, but I believe it's better than all the other alternatives that have been offered, and it's the one I want us to continue to follow. I also believe, however, that the free market responds to the conditions that are placed upon it by policymakers. And the analogy I always use is the National Football League. The National Football League made a decision about 10 years ago that it wanted more points scored. And so it adjusted its rules. Today, you literally can't touch the quarterback. You can't even be rude to the quarterback because you'll get a 15-yard penalty. But there used to be a time where you couldn't even extend your hands to block. You couldn't bump a guy down the field without it being at any time. Or there used to be a time where you could bump them as long as the ball wasn't in the air. They restricted all of this so much. There used to be a time when free safeties in the NFL weighed 225 pounds because they used to take your head off if you went over the middle. Today, they're all smaller. Not because big people don't exist anymore, but because the game was changed. So you can't really hit people anymore down the field that way, especially if they're defenseless. You can't touch the quarterback. Blocking's become easier. The rules. It's still football. And what's most interesting about it is neither one of the teams playing the game care about scoring more points. They just want to win. That's the goal of both of the teams. But the policymakers decided our goal for the league is to score more points, and we're going to adjust the rules. And so the question becomes, we want free market. But we have to ensure that the rules under which free market operates are rules that are good, that achieve the goals that we have for America. And I'm here to tell you that the rules cannot simply be the growth of GDP. You do need GDP growth. You do need economic growth. But that alone will not be enough if the architecture of the economy is such that all of that growth flows to one section of the economy at the expense of the rest of the economy. And I can tell you where that's really become problematic is in our view that Americans are consumers. That life should be judged and our economy should be judged by how cheap prices are and how easy it is for Americans to buy things. That's only one side of the equation. Few, if any, Americans get deep satisfaction from their role as a consumer. Well, maybe some people get deep satisfaction from the role as a consumer, but not solely that. I can tell you that it's why I believe so strongly in the dignity of work. Because the inability to get up in the morning and do something productive that you're rewarded and valued for, when you can no longer do that, when the economy no longer provides you the opportunity to do it, or you don't have the skills to do it, or something keeps you from doing it, it's corrosive, first to the human spirit, but it has an impact on families, on communities, and ultimately on a nation. And we have seen that in the 6 to 8 million Americans who are able-bodied and are not working. And I don't think it's because they're lazy. I think it's for a lot of different reasons. But at the end of the day, it's corrosive to the human spirit not to have that. There's a dignity attached to meaningful work that plays itself out in our culture and in our society and ultimately for the good of our country. And that has to be one of the priorities of our policymaking. And it's why I've pushed public policies that don't just lend economic growth, but economic growth that leads to the creation of stable and good-paying jobs because of what it would mean for our country, what it would mean for our society, for stronger families and stronger communities. Embedded in that notion is the fact that we have to rethink it. We're no longer in competition between companies. Much of our policies are built on a world in which our company competed against another company. Today, these are multinational companies in many cases. And number two, they're not competing with another company. They're competing with a nation state. When your chief competitor is a company in China, they are backed by the Chinese government. They have a monopoly on their own domestic economy of 1.4 billion people, but they're also subset. Some of these deals that they do, they don't make a profit. There's no way they could offer the goods or services they're offering at a profit, even with low labor costs. They are subsidized by the government for purposes of taking over those industries, and we have to rethink that. The other thing is that, global trade is good, but it has to be fair. And it has to be equitable. And we also have to understand that, yes, these changes are good. They create a bunch of great new jobs, and they displace people. But the people being displaced are not necessarily going to automatically be the people that get the great new jobs. And you can't just say, go to school and get a degree and become a coder. That's not easy to say to a 45-year-old steel worker or auto worker in the Midwest, or someone who's worked in one line of work their whole lives. Get up and move to Silicon Valley. It's not realistic. And we haven't paid enough attention to that either. The flip side of it, of course, I mean, the answer to all this, by the way, is one of the things I'm deeply concerned about, and that is the sole focus on returning profits to shareholders. Nothing wrong with that. It's great. If you're a shareholder especially, it's important for our retirement funds. But we have seen a dangerous diminishment in the amount of innovation and investment in the future capacity of our nation. And that is particularly acute in the key industries of the 21st century. We're going to have to rethink all of that. On the left, I would just say, I largely spend my time talking about the ways we need to be thinking on my side of the aisle, but on the other side of the aisle, I would just point two things. Number one, I think identity politics, in my view, is not what I think America is an explicit rejection of identity politics. It is the belief that American has nothing to do with the color of your skin. Now, that does not mean that we ignore disparities. That does not mean that we ignore disparities built up from historical realities. But that does mean we spend a lot more time reminding people that being an American is nothing, should have nothing to do with the color of your skin, how your last name is pronounced, or where your parents were born. That's what makes America and Americanism so unique, and we can never lose that. And the other is, look, I just outwardly reject socialism. I just do not believe socialism works. And I don't believe that it will ever reach the results that Americans expect or want. So, I think that's the first thing. On the second point, I'll be quick here, is, we've got to make our republic work again. No republic, no democracy can function unless the different groups in society are unwilling completely to work with the other side on some things. It just can't function. This idea that somehow I can win and you can lose every single time doesn't just work from a mechanical standpoint. It ultimately doesn't work from a societal standpoint. You cannot have a stable country in which a third of your population, no matter how crazy or wrong you may think they are, and that applies to everybody, no matter who maybe some of you think I'm crazy, maybe I think you're crazy, but you cannot live in a country where 1/3 of the population is habitually and regularly run over by the rest of the country. And in fact, it's not even 1/3, it's about half and half now. This notion of total victory, that we're going to win every battle and we're going to get 100% all the time and the other side is not, it is ridiculous. It doesn't work. You can't have a democracy and you cannot have a republic in a system like that. And it's important for leaders at every level not to make those arguments. And that's hard to do, because when you're trying to win an election, you want to portray to people, I'm the person that's going to win for us. We're going to go undefeated every year. And the other side's going to lose all the time. But no one can, the only way they can deliver on that is to void or run around the Constitution, or, frankly, try to get the other side to capitulate to the point that it divides us and we become ungovernable. And so it's not that I'm saying this because I think we should all get along and hold hands and pretend we don't have differences. It's not because I don't think we should have vibrant and active debates. I just think that governing all of this is the realization that there is no way that America can be the country we want it to be if half the people in this country who happen to disagree with us are locked out and run over on a consistent basis. It will not work. It cannot work. And we've got to try to figure out how to share this space that we've been given, this great nation, with people that we disagree with on a lot of things. And that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of leadership. My last point, and probably of the three, this is the hardest, because it's perhaps the one that we can do the least about in the political realm, and that is what to do with this culture of outrage and this tendency to believe the most outrageous things possible, because we've lost a belief in everything. And I'm not talking about not having healthy skepticism. I think it is important to question authority and ask questions and make sure we're getting the full story on things. But I also think it's important for us to not jump on every conspiracy that you read or hear about, no matter how exciting they might seem, or how much you hope that they might be true for some reason. Donald Trump is not a Russian agent. Obama's birth certificate was not falsified. Epstein wasn't murdered by either Clinton or Trump. And the U.S. was not fabricating evidence about Iran's activities in the Middle East. And yet these are all things that at some point in time were pursued and had to answer questions about. The latest of all these, other than the Epstein thing, was I remember a few months ago when the IRGC in Iran was clearly undertaking aggressive actions. They were trying to, they attached a landmine to the side of a ship. And we had people in Congress, in this case on the other side of the aisle, saying, well, how do we know that's true? And just think about it for a moment. First of all, who was it? It wasn't the Swiss. It wasn't the Belgians. So they're the only people in the Middle East that could have been doing that. That's number one. Number two, what they were basically saying is that hundreds of people in the Department of Defense, sworn to defend this country, were lying. and making up and doctoring a video. We hired some actors to go out in a fast boat and attach something that looked like a landmine onto a boat. But this became a real thing for a couple weeks. And those things are problematic. And the others I don't need to explain to you. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't need to question or ask things or even be skeptical, frankly. But that's different from buying into everything that's out there. And sometimes if something sounds too crazy, it may be. It really may be. So I don't know. I would look into that. It's especially dangerous in an era in which we have multiple foreign powers trying to drive those debates. So in closing, how would people describe this era? I wrote some notes, some of the things I picked up. People say, we have broad inequality between the rich and the poor. We have sharp divisions, particularly urban versus rural Americans. Democracy appears to be challenged at home, and around the world we see a rise of nationalism and totalitarianism. We have this new media that connects more people, but is also disorienting them and misinforming them sometimes. We have refugee flows around the world that are triggering nationalism and pushback. We have political figures who in many ways are inspirational to large numbers of people, but are also hostile sometimes to reason or believe that the ends justify the means. And then these are characteristics I've read. Well, I can argue to you that these characteristics are the same ones we faced in the 1930s. In essence, we've been here before, and this time I hope we can avoid a world war to bring that to an end. And in fact, we must, because the next world war will be the last one. But what it will take is leadership, and not just political leadership, but societal leadership. And where I really pin my hopes on is younger Americans, 18 to 35. That number keeps moving down as I get older. It used to be, but I do. I always tell, I have a daughter now who's a sophomore in college, a senior in high school, a freshman in high school, a sixth grader. I'll have 2 voters at home by November, so that's good. 4 including me, but yeah. But I hope they don't make some of the excuses or some of the mistakes that my generation made that has led us to some of these points that we're at today. And I hope that what we can inspire today and in the years to come is leadership that uses these new media opportunities to inspire people, to inform them, to mobilize them to action, instead of looking always for ways to divide and to inflame. I hope that at the same time as being able to do that we'll have leadership that can address those who feel forgotten and left behind, but with a message that sort of shows the way forward and gives a nod to how complex some of these issues are and the real choices before us to get there, how long they'll take, how hard it will be. I think people need, but you cannot ignore these things either and couch them and chalk them up to something that is illegitimate. I hope that these leaders, even as they do that, will protect and model the norms of civilized behavior, but most importantly of our constitutional republic, of how important that is as a guideline that serves as what protects how unique our system of government is and how it's persevered for over 2 centuries. And that they will consistently defend liberty around the world. That doesn't make you a hawk that wants to invade countries. It makes you a leader that says clearly and without any sort of misunderstanding that democracy and freedom is morally superior to authoritarian and totalitarianism. That it's not just better, it's morally superior. It is morally superior to give people a voice and a role in who governs them than it is to believe that one human being or a small number of human beings know what's right for you and for your family and cannot be questioned. And I hope our leaders will be clear and resolute in arguing that in the years to come. We have a lot to be hopeful of. Despite all these challenges I've just outlined, I look around the world today and there isn't a nation on earth that I would trade places with, not one. Because if we've got problems, they've got problems. And I think the difference between us and some of these other places, and some of them are great, and some of them are great allies, and have cultures that I admire. But what makes us different, and I hope, and what will get us through this is what's always gotten through this, and that is the American people. The belief that because here people have the freedom and the opportunity to move forward, we will solve these problems. People will not be held back by the circumstances of their births or by the fact that their parents weren't in leaderships and so they cannot be themselves, but that here we have multiple people now and in generations to come who will be given the opportunity to rise to the occasion and lead us to a new American century. I believe that that's what our destiny is. It has to be. Because I cannot imagine a place and I cannot imagine a world in which America does not remain the world's most important, influential, and powerful country. Because if the most powerful and influential nation on earth is not America, it will likely be a totalitarian and authoritarian nation who doesn't even care about the rights of its own people. It will most certainly not care about the rights of ours. So thank you for the chance to talk to you about all this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You can stand there. Thank you, Senator Rubio. So now the tough part, our student speakers. Our wonderful volunteer, Chuck Zettler, is with our students today. They come directly from the students, and I'm going to turn it over to our first table from Suncoast High.
Hi, my name is Lauren Brensel from Suncoast High School, and my question is, as a student facing fears of gun violence every day, how will the Senate act to address issues like gun control, school safety, and mental health to create a safer environment for me and my peers?
Important. First, I'll answer that question not just as a senator, but as I said earlier, as a father of 3 kids that are in school now and a 4th that's at a university. And so there's no way, and they're not immune to the same fears and to the same threats. I think after what happened in Parkland in 2018, I went back and sort of really dug deep into both what we knew about all of these mass shootings that had occurred and what they had in common. And some of them have very little in common. For example, the one in Las Vegas defies explanation. We don't, to this day, know the motivation. We know that this is someone who had passed not just background checks, but the strictest ones you can imagine with the permitting that he had, and yet did something that to this day doesn't seem to have a rationale. We know very little about it, and perhaps never will. But there was some common themes. And the one common theme in almost all of them, the first is, before they did what they did, there were people around them that knew they were dangerous. But they either had no one to go to about it or chose not to go, because sometimes if someone's close to you, you may think they're weird, but you don't think they'd possibly ever do something like this. That was most certainly the case in Parkland, but it was also the case in Pulse, where not once but twice the FBI interviewed this individual because he told people that he was a radical jihadist. And it's been the case in other places. And so from all that then I looked and said, okay, well, what can you do? When you know that there's someone out there that's exhibiting clear signs that they're going to do something, the ideal way to stop them is to get to them before they act. And hence the idea came of figuring out a federal law that would incentivize more states to pass extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, because it now is a tool that law enforcement and/or direct family members can use to go to court and prevent these things from happening before they do. The second is threat assessment. And that's actually modeled after the way we protect the President of the United States. The President of the United States is protected not simply by the agents that surround them, but by the fact that the Secret Service has a running tally of every individual in America who could possibly pose a threat to the President or his or her family. And they are constantly analyzing that. In Los Angeles, California, we met with them twice. They've established a model of threat assessment. And it's a combination of the local school district, the hospitals, the mental health network, all the law enforcement agencies, on a regular basis meet, compare notes on a data set of a couple hundred individuals that they believe could potentially take violent action, and they're constantly assessing that threat. And that's the Eagles Act that we have also been involved in filing in the Senate, as well as filing the red flag law bill both in 2018 and again on the first day of this new Congress. So I think the passage of those two things will provide a very valuable tool to assess people who could possibly take action, and also have a way to go to court and prevent them from doing it. And I want to say one more thing about the red flag laws, because they do have to have due process. Okay, we don't want people being falsely accused and having a constitutional right taken from them without due process. But it will potentially prevent mass shootings, but it will prevent suicides. In many cases, what this is a family who's terrified that their son or daughter has purchased a handgun and is talking about killing themselves, and there is nothing you can do about it. Unless you can get a Baker Act, there's nothing you can do about it, because they have not committed a crime. They have not been adjudicated of anything. And so I believe that those two things are the ones that we can get consensus on, that we can pass, and that we should do. And there are other issues people want dealt with. That's fine to debate those. But why can't we do the things we agree on? and continue to debate the things that we do not. I don't understand this thinking that unless we can do it all, we can't do any of it. And I think that is a false choice, and it's frankly one that's detrimental and a pretty good example of the ability to get things. Let's make progress on this, and I think those two things have a chance to pass if given a fair chance to be voted on.
Thank you, Senator. All right, now our students from Forest Hill High School.
Hi, my name is Kristen Kazin. I'm from Forest Hill High School. And my question is, what is the #1 issue you believe the Senate has yet to resolve, and what has the impact of this inaction been?
Well, I think that there's, unfortunately, there isn't one #1 issue, but I think they're sort of all fall under the same umbrella, and that is that we need to modernize our politics. I don't mean, more people using electronics. I mean, modernize it to realize that we live in a very different world than the ones our laws were written for. So as an example, on foreign policy, much of our foreign policy for 20 years since 9/11 had been geared towards counterterror, and counterterror is still a big deal. But we have now entered an era of great power competition. We are engaged in a competition with China that we need to take. They are no longer a poor developing country. They are a direct challenger, not just today, but in the industries that will define the 21st century. I see one of your speakers is going to talk about 5G upcoming in a few weeks. People don't understand how important. That's not about being able to watch Netflix easier online. 5G is the platform upon which many of the 21st century industries are going to be built. Autonomous vehicles will rely on them extensively. If you dominate the global 5G, you dominate autonomous vehicles. You dominate additive manufacturing, which means 3D printing replacement parts. As opposed to having to order them online and having them delivered to you, you can actually print them if you have the raw material at your facility or out at sea or are in space. And whichever nation dominates these industries is going to dominate the economy of the 21st century. And 5G is the core that a lot of this will be built upon. So I don't think our policies have been modernized in that regard. I think domestically is the realization that some of the normal historical or economic figures that we've looked upon to tell us whether the economy is doing well or not don't mean what they used to mean anymore. And that we need to recognize that GDP growth alone doesn't tell us the health of our economy. It's not just how much growth is being created, but how is it being distributed, and how is it creating the sort of meaningful work that is critical to having strong families and strong communities, because without strong families and strong communities, you will not have a strong country. It's as simple as that. And I'm not saying jobs alone will solve that problem, but you can't have it without it. And so I think those are important issues that we do need to confront. They're big, they involve more than one law or more than one approach, and frankly, some of the things we need to do about those things aren't even government related. Because my last point on this is, one of the things I'm really worried about is that in these industries of the 21st century, we're relying solely on the private sector to invest in technology and innovation to corner these markets, and you've seen a decline in private sector investment. Because if you're a company and your profits are being entirely returned to shareholders as opposed to invested in the next great innovation in your product, you're not innovating for the future. And government investment in basic research has also declined. And so you look at the space program, many and some of the technologies we take for granted today, the internet, GPS, you name it, all MRI scan, CAT scans, these were all spin-offs of military and or space-related technologies that were first innovated to solve a government problem. So I do think there's a role for not just government research and investment in some of this, but also changes in our tax code to incentivize private sector research and innovation in these technologies.
Thank you. The Republican, all right, next question. This is a test of my eyes. The Republican Party used to be the party that at least gave lip service to fiscal restraint. We're now looking at a $1 trillion deficit added to our outstanding debt. What is your perspective on this, and what do you see as a plan for starting to make a dent in the deficit?
I think, first of all, it's being honest with people about what's causing it, and no one wants to hear it because it makes, for bad politics. Our national debt is not driven by discretionary spending. About only a third of the federal budget Congress controls. There's about a third that we can cut or increase any given year. Increasingly, 2/3 of our budget is driven by what's called mandatory spending, which basically means we have to spend whatever it is that people are eligible for. And when you talk about Medicare as an example, a program my mother is on and I support fully, okay? But that's mandatory spending. Mandatory spending means if you reach the right age and eligibility requirements, we have to spend whatever it is you're entitled to because you paid into the system, and we made that promise to you. But now what we're going to have is we're going to have the largest, second largest now generation in American history, because apparently Generation Y, I lose track, is it Y or Z, is larger than the boomers, but the boomers are big. And they're going to live longer than people have ever lived. And they're going to retire and increasing every day. So you're going to have the largest number of people ever living longer than they ever have in a system that was designed very differently for a different demographic makeup. And that growth in spending, along with some other programs, is what's going to drive our future debt. So the only way to bring it into sustainability is to reform those programs. And the argument I've made now for the better part of a decade is there is a way to deal with this that doesn't cut anyone's benefits, that doesn't reduce your benefits, but is going to require people like me, I'm 48, I feel 49, but I'm 48, my Medicare might be a little bit different than my parents', meaning I may have to retire 3 months later than my 65th birthday or whatever. We can still do that, but that is the only way to bring, anybody who tells you that we can slash foreign aid and that will bring us to balance is lying to you. Foreign aid is less than 1% of our budget. It's just not true. You cannot, the discretionary spending is not, you cannot solve 100% of your problem by only focusing on a third of your spending. And that's what we've basically done. So, and especially when some of that is embedded in the Defense Department, which is the number one obligation the federal government has, to defend our country. So that is the only answer. And I'm sorry to tell you that's and the longer we wait to deal with it, the more disruptive those changes are going to be. And that doesn't make for good politics, and it makes it easier for people to run ads saying they want to take away your Medicare, take away your Social Security. It isn't true. The only people who want to take away Medicare and Social Security are the people that are prepared to bankrupt it by making no reforms for future beneficiaries, not current or people about to retire. I'm not going to ask a 55-year-old that's about to retire in 10 years to change everything. But if you're 19, 20, 21, and you give a choice between a debt crisis that collapses your economy and your future and some small but important changes, I think I'd choose the small and important changes. I think we should be honest with people about that, and right now we're not seeing that from either side, frankly.
Thank you, Senator. You talked about foreign policy, so I think this is an important question, and I think you can help enlighten this. Regarding Venezuela, things have quieted down there. What is next for Maduro? What for his regime? The protests seem to have stopped. Media attention has stopped, but the situation isn't resolved.
Yeah, it's it has no precedent. Like, people compare Venezuela to Syria. It's not Syria. There's nothing like Syria and Venezuela. I mean, other than the guy in charge is a criminal. But they're not in any way similar. Venezuela is really not even a government issue. Venezuela has been taken over by a mafia. I mean, that's the best way to explain it. It is an organized crime ring. A lot of people don't understand there is no ideological affinity to Maduro. None. The people surrounding him have no loyalty to the guy. None whatsoever. The only reason why they're still, quote unquote, sticking with him is because these people are making a lot of money. As an example, there are billions of dollars of cocaine that is flown with the full cooperation of the military, quote unquote, in Venezuela. Someone's making a lot of money off that stuff, and they're saying to themselves, if Maduro goes down, I'm going to lose this valuable concession. So I would love to get rid of him and find maybe me or somebody else to take charge, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet without putting myself in danger. So until I do, let's just leave him there. And like that, I can tell you there's illegal mining. I mean, they're literally mining cobalt and gold and selling it out in the black market or in the global markets after they launder it. So he is surrounded by people that have become multimillionaires, not because they innovated some great product, but because they are literally stealing everything from food and selling it on the black market to gold to selling drugs. And if Maduro goes down, they go down with him, and they're going to either be in jail or dead or in exile. And so that's why they stick with him. This is what this is. It is a mafia. Simple. Now, understand that our public policy has been to support the constitutionally legitimate National Assembly, and that's what we're going to continue to do, and to target the people who are making all this money. So you're going to steal all this money, that's fine, but we're not going to let you, it's not fine actually, but we're not going to let you enjoy it. We're not going to let you enjoy it. They steal the money. None of this oil money reached the Venezuelan people. It all went into their pockets. We're not going to let you steal it and then enjoy it. We're going to continue to make it harder for you to bank. We're going to make it impossible for you to go out and grab the $5 million that you had parked in a bank in London. We're going to make life difficult for you. We're not going to allow you to continue to sail smooth and easy. Now, I say all that to you. You ask what's next for Maduro. I have no doubt Maduro will fall. So one way or the other, Maduro is going to be gone. What I worry about is not that Maduro is not going to be there. This is not just about Maduro. It's about what's next. Because if Maduro is eliminated and replaced by another regime insider who just wants to be, I don't know, a less anti-American dictator, that's still bad, especially if it's a drug dealer. You know, so just think about it that way. And that's the part that I'm more concerned about, is a palace coup that winds up not in democracy, but in a reset that allows the world to truly take its attention. So my prediction is Maduro will at some point be moved on by people around him, and that could trigger a series of events. I'm not telling you that Venezuela is going to go from that to becoming, you know, Belgium overnight. I am telling you that there will be a transition, but the arrow has to be pointed in the direction of freedom and democracy and constitutional order, and that the U.S. can be supportive of that. What we cannot be supportive of is you just change the name on the letterhead to a different dictator and pretend that things are back to normal. That we can't be a part of and won't be supportive of. And, but it's a very difficult situation, and it continues to get worse.
Thank you, Senator. So last question, but you have to come back again. We've got stacks of questions for you. They're all excellent about the environment, local economy, so I hope you'll come back when you're in town again, and we love having you. So last question. The senator graduated from the University of Florida and the University of Miami.
That's an easy, I know what you're going to ask me. It's
There's
an easy
a big
choice.
football game Saturday in Orlando. Who do you think is going to win, and who are you going to be rooting for?
That's not even a tough question. I'm rooting for the University of Florida. Go Gators. Listen, no, hold on. I don't root against the University of Miami, but, you know, I went to law school there, and I owed them over $100,000 when I was done. I didn't owe Florida a penny, you know? So, but anyway, no, luckily, I used to tell people, the good news is they don't play that often, so I don't have to make that choice. I don't have to root against Miami. Now they're going to play a home and away series in a couple years, so it's going to get harder, but yeah, I hope Miami wins every other game this year. Go Gators.
Good answer.
All right, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much.
For joining us. We'll see you October 7th.